Number 1. The Tiwanaku shaman's drug pouch. Picture a stone shelter high in the Bolivian Andes 3,900 meters above the sea, where the air is thin and the cold never fully leaves the rock. In 1919, in the year 900 to 1170 of the Common Era, someone hid a bundle here, and the dryness and the altitude kept it almost perfectly. When archaeologists Jose Capriles of Penn State and Melanie Miller finally analyzed it and published their findings in the journal PNAS in 2019, the bundle turned out to be the most chemically loaded ritual kit ever pulled from the ground. The centerpiece was a pouch stitched together from 3 fox snouts. Beside it lay carved wooden snuff tablets, a snuffing tube, and braided headbands. And inside that fox snout bag, the chemistry told an astonishing story. Liquid chromatography paired with mass spectrometry detected not 1 drug, not 2, but at least 5 psychoactive compounds at the same time. There was cocaine and its breakdown product benzoylecgonine, which point to coca leaf. There was bufotenine, which comes from the seeds of the vilca tree. And there was harmine alongside dimethyltryptamine, the 2 ingredients that together make an ayahuasca-like brew. Here's the part that should stop you. Dimethyltryptamine, on its own, is destroyed in the gut and does nothing when swallowed. It only becomes active if you combine it with a monoamine oxidase inhibitor, and harmine is exactly that. Whoever owned this bag understood, 1,000 years ago, a piece of applied biochemistry that Western science would not formally describe until the 20th century. None of these plants grow at that altitude. Every one of them had to be carried across enormous ecological distances, which means this shaman sat at the center of a long-range trade network in mind-altering substances. The pouch itself was radiocarbon dated to around the year 1100, and the leather was likely cut from 3 pelts of the Andean fox. This is, to date, the largest number of psychoactive substances ever found together in a single pre-Columbian assemblage, and that abundance is the whole point. No modern physician would ever combine a stimulant, 2 tryptamine hallucinogens, and an enzyme inhibitor in a single dose. Both bufotenine and DMT are Schedule 1 drugs in the United States today, yet here was a specialist treating them as a curated personal pharmacopoeia, a working pharmacy carried in a bag. How much of this was healing? How much was religion? And how much was raw political power is something we will never fully untangle. This is where our story begins, but the next drug is far older, and its secret was written into rotting grain. Number 2. Ergot and the Eleusinian kykeon. For nearly 2,000 years, from around 1500 before the Common Era until the year 392, the most important religious rite in the Greek world was held at Eleusis near Athens. Initiates fasted, walked a sacred road, and then drank a potion called the kykeon, made of barley, water, and mint. After they drank it, many reported overwhelming visions, a sense of death and rebirth, a confrontation with the divine, and then they were sworn to absolute secrecy, on pain of death. Almost no one ever wrote down what they saw, which is why, to this day, we are still arguing about what was in the cup. The most provocative answer points to ergot. Ergot is the dark, curved body of a fungus called Claviceps purpurea, which infects rye and other grasses, swelling out of the grain like a black claw. It contains a family of compounds called ergoline alkaloids, and they are chemically close cousins of LSD. In fact, when the chemist Albert Hofmann first made LSD in 1938 at the Sandoz Laboratories, he made it from lysergic acid derived from ergot. In 1978, Hofmann teamed up with the classicist Carl Ruck and the mycologist Gordon Wasson to argue that the kykeon was a controlled ergot extract. The trick is that some ergot compounds like ergine and ergonovine are water-soluble and psychoactive, while the truly toxic blood vessel clamping ones are less so. A careful water extraction could, in theory, separate the vision from the poison. And the poison was real. Uncontrolled ergot caused mass outbreaks the medieval world called St. Anthony's fire. In one form, blood vessels clamped shut and limbs blackened and rotted away. In another, victims convulsed and hallucinated. A single outbreak in southern France in the year 944 may have killed as many as 40,000 people. Some researchers, like Linda Caporael in 1976, even blamed convulsive ergotism for the Salem witch accusations. Mainstream classicists reject the ergot theory and say the visions were psychological. The mysteries themselves were banned by the Emperor Theodosius, and the sanctuary destroyed soon after. Greece guarded its drug with a death oath. Another civilization carved its drug into the walls of a temple. Number 3. Chavín de Huántar's San Pedro Mescaline cult. In the Peruvian highlands, 3,180 meters up, stands a temple complex called Chavín de Huántar. It was built and used between roughly 1200 and 500 before the Common Era, and it has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1985. At its heart, in a maze of underground stone galleries, stands the Lanzón, a carved granite monolith 4.5 meters tall, depicting a fanged deity. And carved on the temple's stones, again and again, are human figures holding a tall, columnar cactus. That cactus is San Pedro, and San Pedro contains mescaline, one of the most powerful and long-lasting hallucinogens known. For decades, this was suggestive but unproven. Then, in May of 2025, a team led by Daniel Contreras of the University of Florida published direct chemical evidence in PNAS. Inside the private chambers of the temple, they found snuff tubes carved from bone, and those tubes tested positive for residues of nicotine from wild tobacco and vilca. Crucially, the drug use was not communal. It was restricted to small, exclusive groups deep inside the galleries. The archaeologist John Rick of Stanford spent decades arguing that this entire structure was a machine built to manufacture authority, and the chemistry now backs him up. The galleries are nearly lightless. They were engineered with ventilation ducts, water channels, and acoustic features. Add a hallucinogen that lasts 10 to 12 hours, and you have total control over a person's reality. Think about what that means. The priests of Chavín were not simply getting high. They were using sensory deprivation, architecture, sound from conch shell trumpets, and a carefully restricted drug to convince initiates that the priests had supernatural power. Mescaline itself was first isolated by the chemist Arthur Hefter in 1897 and synthesized by Ernst Speth in 1919. Modern medicine has essentially no use for it, partly because its effects last so long and run so intense that shorter compounds are simply more practical. At Chavín, that very intensity was the point. Here the drug has a name we can speak. The next one was worshipped as a literal god, and we still cannot say what it was. Number 4. Soma, the Rig Veda's lost god drug. Somewhere between 1500 and 1200 before the Common Era, the people who composed the Rig Veda, the oldest layer of Hindu scripture, sang the praises of a drug so powerful they treated it as a deity. They called it Soma. An entire book of the Rig Veda, the 9th mandala, with all 114 of its hymns, is devoted to it. Soma was a plant, and the juice pressed from that plant, and a god, all at once. The hymns describe crushing the plant between stones, straining the juice through wool, and mixing it with milk. And then they describe the effect in unforgettable words. One hymn simply declares, "We have drunk Soma and become immortal." And here is the great mystery. Nobody today knows what Soma was. The knowledge was lost, probably because the people who used it migrated away from wherever the plant grew. Scholars have been fighting about its identity for over a century. In 1968, Gordon Wasson argued that Soma was the fly agaric mushroom, Amanita muscaria, the iconic red toadstool with white spots, which contains the compounds muscimol and ibotenic acid. He pointed to a strange detail. The active compounds in fly agaric pass through the body and remain potent in urine, and both the Rig Veda and Siberian shamanic tradition contain hints of recycling that urine. Others disagree completely. A strong rival theory says Soma was ephedra, the stimulant plant. And they note that Zoroastrian priests still prepare a ritual drink called hauma from ephedra to this day. But ephedra is a stimulant, not a visionary drug, which is the main objection. Still, other candidates include Syrian rue, which contains harmine, cannabis, and even blue lotus. The botanist Terence McKenna favored a psilocybe mushroom, an idea most ethnobotanists reject. Excavations at the Bronze Age Bactria Margiana complex, dated to roughly 2300 to 1700 before the Common Era and led by Victor Sarianidi, Turned-up vessels and so-called white rooms he claimed were used to prepare Soma, or Haumi, though later residue tests are hotly disputed. There is a darker edge to the fly agaric theory too. Its active compounds are musamil, which calms the brain by mimicking a neurotransmitter, and ibotenic acid, which is genuinely neurotoxic, so even this candidate is a drug that punishes a careless dose. The truth is that the preparation was guarded, ritual, narrow knowledge, and once the chain broke, the recipe vanished. No modern medicine descends from Soma for the simple reason that we cannot agree on what it was. Soma is dangerous because it is a mystery. The next drug is dangerous because vision and death wear the same face. Number 5, Datura and the Pinwheel Cave Oracle. In a cave in the southern San Joaquin region of California, there is a red painting on the ceiling shaped like a pinwheel. For years, its meaning was unclear. Then researchers realized it matched something precisely. It matched the way the flower of sacred Datura unfurls at dawn, twisting open in a slow spiral. The cave is called Pinwheel Cave, and it belonged to the Chumash and their neighbors. In November of 2020, a team led by David Robinson of the University of Central Lancashire published a discovery in PNAS that changed how we understand sites like this. Wedged into crevices in the cave ceiling were chewed lumps of plant fiber, called quids. When they analyzed those quids with electron microscopy and mass spectrometry, they found scopolamine and atropine, the signature tropane alkaloids of Datura. Some of the quids dated to between roughly 1530 and 1890. This was the first clear archaeological proof that a rock art site was not just a place where people painted their visions, but a place where they actually took the drug. And Datura is not a gentle drug, it is a deliriant. Where a classic psychedelic produces visions, our visions, Datura produces hallucinations completely indistinguishable from reality. People under its influence hold conversations with people who are not there. The mechanism is brutal in its simplicity. The tropane alkaloids block acetylcholine, a key neurotransmitter, throwing the brain into delirium, blurring vision, and erasing memory. And the dosing is almost impossible to control, because the alkaloid content varies wildly from plant to plant, season to season, even part to part of the same plant. The margin between a visionary dose and a lethal one is nearly invisible. The Chumash knew this. Their Datura initiation, called Momoi, was supervised by specialists who understood the danger. Modern medicine still uses scopolamine in microgram doses for motion sickness and atropine to restart a slow heart or to treat nerve agent poisoning. But raw Datura is far too unpredictable to use, and it still kills teenagers every year. Datura blurs the line by accident. The next plant was bred to sit exactly on it. Number 6. Aconite, the queen of poisons. There's a tall, elegant plant with hooded flowers of deep blue purple that has been called for centuries the queen of poisons. Its names are monkshood and wolfsbane, and its scientific name is aconitum. It contains a toxin called aconitine. An aconitine is one of the most efficient killers in the plant kingdom. It works by jamming open the voltage-gated sodium channels in your nerves and heart muscle, so the cells can never reset. The result is a galloping, fatal disturbance of the heart's rhythm. The lethal dose is as little as 1 to 2 milligrams of the pure toxin, or just a few grams of the raw plant. The name wolfsbane tells you its oldest use. People smeared it on arrows and left it as bait to kill wolves and other predators. In Greek myth, aconite was said to have sprung from the saliva of Cerberus, the three-headed hound of the underworld, as Heracles dragged the beast into the light. The ancient writers Theophrastus and Dioscorides both described its toxicity, and in Rome, growing, it was reportedly treated as a capital offense, because it was such a favored tool of assassins. The symptoms are the stuff of nightmares. First, a tingling and numbness spreads across the mouth and face, then numbness floods the whole body. Then the heart fails. It can all happen within hours, and there is no specific antidote. Doctors can only support the patient and fight the arrhythmia. And yet, astonishingly, aconite was also medicine. In traditional Chinese and Ayurvedic practice, processed aconite root, carefully detoxified to reduce the aconitine, was prescribed for pain and cold conditions. In 19th century Europe, it appeared in pharmacopoeias as a painkiller and fever reducer, The Victorian poisoner Dr. George Henry Lamson used it in 1881 precisely because he believed it could not be detected. The problem that finally drove it out of Western medicine was its therapeutic window. The dose that helps and the dose that kills are simply too close together. Aconite also haunted the edges of European witchcraft, named as an ingredient in the so-called flying ointments alongside other nightshades. Poisonings still happen today, most often from the misuse of herbal preparations in East Asia, and the plant's tall purple spikes make it a popular garden ornamental, which only raises the risk of an accident. Researchers continue to study aconitine-like molecules, including its relatives mesaconitine and hypoconitine, in the hope of finding a safer painkiller, but the parent toxin itself remains uncontrollable. Aconite killed with precision. The next drug put people to sleep on the surgeon's table, and sometimes they never woke. Number 7. Mandrake, Antiquity's surgical anesthetic. Long before ether, long before any modern anesthetic, surgeons needed a way to keep a patient from feeling the knife. One of their answers was mandrake. Mandrake is a Mediterranean member of the nightshade family, and its thick taproot frequently splits into a forked shape that looks eerily like a tiny human body. That resemblance fed thousands of years of folklore, including the famous legend that the root screams when pulled from the earth, killing anyone who hears it, which is why people supposedly tied a dog to it to do the uprooting. But underneath the myth was real pharmacology. The root contains the tropane alkaloids hyoscyamine, scopolamine, and atropine, the same family we just met in Datura. The medical use is documented with surprising clarity. The Greek physician Dioscorides, writing around the year 70, explicitly described a wine made from mandrake that was given to patients so they would feel nothing while being cut or cauterized. He even discussed measuring the dose. Pliny the Elder, writing a few years later, recorded the same soporific power. Centuries later, medieval surgeons developed the soporific sponge, a sponge soaked in a mixture of mandrake, opium, henbane, and hemlock, which the patient inhaled to be put under. Surgeons at Salerno and Bologna, including Hugh of Lucca and Theodoric Borgognoni in the 13th century, wrote down recipes for it. So mandrake genuinely worked. The tropane alkaloids really do produce drowsiness, amnesia, and at higher doses, unconsciousness. But that is also exactly the danger. The same compounds that send a patient to sleep can stop the breathing and stop the heart. And wild mandrake's alkaloid content is maddeningly inconsistent. You could never be sure whether you were giving a sleeping dose or a killing one. Modern medicine eventually extracted and purified the individual alkaloids. Scopolamine was used in the early 20th century for the obstetric anesthesia known as twilight sleep, and atropine and scopolamine remain in the anesthesiologist's kit today, in precise microdoses. The ancient intuition was correct. The crude root was simply too erratic. Mandrake smoke and wine pulled patients under. The next civilization burned its drug on hot stones to reach the dead. Number 8. Scythian, Cannabis, and the Jirzankal braziers. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing in the 5th century before the Common Era, described a strange practice among the Scythians, the nomads of the steppe. He said they would sit inside a small tent, throw cannabis onto red-hot stones, and howl with joy as the vapor filled the air. For a long time, this was treated as a traveler's tall tale. Then archaeology caught up with him. High in the eastern Pamir Mountains of western China, at a burial site called Jirzankal, around 3,000 meters up, researchers excavated 10 wooden braziers, each holding burnt stones and charred plant material, from graves dated to about 500 before the Common Era. In 2019, a team led by Yimin Yang and the archaeobotanist Robert Spengler published the chemical analysis in the journal Science Advances. Using gas chromatography and mass spectrometry, they detected cannabinol, abbreviated CBN. Cannabinol is what tetrahydrocannabinol, THC, slowly turns into over time, so its presence is a reliable fingerprint of the original drug. And the levels were high. The cannabis burned in these braziers had an unusually strong THC signature for the period, which means these people were deliberately selecting more potent plants. That is the detail that should land. Wild cannabis is generally low in THC. To get a strong dose, someone had to be choosing or even cultivating toward potency 2,500 years ago. The method itself was effective and completely uncontrolled. Hot stones in a brazier inside an enclosed space turned the plant into a concentrated cloud of inhalable smoke, exactly matching Herodotus's vapor baths. The famous Prehistoric burials in the Altai Mountains, excavated by Sergei Rudenko, had already turned up cannabis burning kits that hinted at the same ritual. Jirzankal sits on an early branch of the Silk Road, suggesting these practices traveled along trade and migration routes, and the setting was a cemetery, which implies the smoke was meant to commune with the dead. Modern worries about high-potency cannabis suddenly look very old. These people were chasing strength 2.5 millennia ago. Cannabis smoke carried ritual. The next drug carried an entire theology in a single flower. Number 9. The Blue Lotus of Egypt. Walk through almost any painted tomb in ancient Egypt and you will see it everywhere. A blue flower held up to the nose, floating on water, steeped in jars of wine. The Egyptians called it a lotus, but botanically it is a water lily, Nymphea caerulea. And it is not just decoration. The flower contains 2 alkaloids, apomorphine and nuciferine. Apomorphine is a dopamine agonist, a compound so real that modern medicine uses it today to treat Parkinson's disease. Nuciferine has sedative and antipsychotic-like properties. The Egyptians, it appears, were soaking these flowers in wine to draw the alkaloids out and produce a gently euphoric, dreamy drink. The blue lotus was woven into the deepest layers of Egyptian religion. The flower opens at dawn and closes at dusk, sinking beneath the water each night and rising again each morning. To the Egyptians, this daily disappearance and return was a perfect image of the sun and of resurrection itself. In one creation myth, the sun god Ra emerges from a primordial blue lotus floating on the waters of chaos. The Book of the Dead describes the deceased transforming into the flower to be reborn. When Howard Carter opened Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922, the imagery of the flower was there too, bound up with the young king's journey into the afterlife. Now, honesty requires a note of caution here. The alkaloid concentration in the blue lotus is modest, far weaker than mescaline or datura, and some scholars argue the Egyptians valued the flower mainly for its fragrance and its symbolism rather than any real high. Apomorphine also causes nausea and vomiting, which would have complicated any attempt to chase euphoria. The likely truth is that the blue lotus lived in the blurred space where perfume, medicine, religion, and mild intoxication all overlapped, a space that ancient pharmacology occupied comfortably and that modern categories struggle to capture. Today, the flower has surged back as a legal herbal high sold in teas and vapes, with very little safety data behind it, and apomorphine itself remains a real prescribed drug for Parkinson's and has even been studied for other conditions. The lotus sat between symbol and drug. The final plant became the most regulated stimulant on Earth. Number 10. Coca leaf and the Andean mummies. We end with a leaf that is at once one of the gentlest and one of the most dangerous drugs in human history, depending entirely on what you do to it. Coca is a group of cultivated shrubs in the genus Erythroxylum, native to the Andes and the edge of the Amazon. Its leaves contain the cocaine alkaloid at a concentration of only about 0.3 to 1.5% by dry weight. Chewed with a pinch of lime or plant ash, which frees the alkaloid, coca releases a mild stimulant effect. It dulls hunger, eases the crushing fatigue of high altitude, and has been part of Andean life for an astonishingly long time. The archaeological evidence for coca chewing on the coast of Peru and Ecuador reaches back roughly 8,000 years. The proof is written into the bodies of the dead. Coca leaf wads and the little gourds that held the lime appear in ancient burials. And chemical traces of benzoylecgonine, a breakdown product of cocaine, show up in the hair of mummies across northern Chile, spanning social classes and thousands of years. The frozen Capacocha children of the Inca, sacrificed around the year 1500 on the summit of Lulailaco, had coca and alcohol in their systems in their final days. To the Andean world, coca was sacred, personified as Mama Coca, central to offerings, divination, and the bonds of reciprocity that held society together. When the Spanish arrived, they first tried to ban it as idolatry, then realized they could tax it and use it to keep silver miners working at altitude. The leaf used this way does not produce the addiction or the devastation of the refined drug. The catastrophe came from concentration. In 1860, the chemist Albert Niemann isolated pure cocaine from coca leaves. Within decades, it was a medical sensation, a local anesthetic, a tonic ingredient, even part of the original Coca-Cola. Sigmund Freud promoted it before anyone understood the danger. Purifying the leaf had transformed a moderate stimulant into one of the most addictive substances on the planet, now a Schedule II drug clinging to a narrow medical role. The leaf was tamed, the extract never could be. And that single fact is the thread running through every drug we have met. There's a line from the 16th century physician Paracelsus that hangs over this entire story. The dose, he said, makes the poison. Nothing is purely a medicine and nothing is purely a poison. There is only the amount. Pharmacologists put a number on this idea and call it the therapeutic index, the ratio between the dose that harms and the dose that helps. A drug with a wide index is forgiving. A drug with a narrow index will kill you if you misjudge it even slightly. And what unites the fox snout pouch, the kykeon, the temple cactus, the screaming root, and the queen of poisons is that every one of them sits at the dangerous end of that scale. Look at the chemistry and the families repeat. The tropane alkaloids appear again and again in Datura, in Mandrake, in henbane, blocking acetylcholine and dragging the mind into delirium. Aconite attacks the sodium channels of the heart. Muscimol and mescaline work on entirely different receptors in the brain. The Bolivian shaman's combination of harmine and dimethyltryptamine was a piece of deliberate, sophisticated biochemistry. But the deepest danger was never just the molecule, it was the variability. A wild plant's potency swings with its species, its season, the soil it grew in, and the part you happen to use. The same handful of leaves could be a mild dose one year and a fatal one the next. This is the problem modern pharmacy solved with purification and standardized milligram dosing, and it is why ancient societies leaned so heavily on specialists. The shaman, the priest, the initiation supervisor were not only spiritual figures, they were the safety equipment. Their guarded knowledge of preparation, of fermenting, filtering, and activating was the only thing standing between a vision and a grave. The Andean trick of chewing coca with lime to free the alkaloid, the water extraction that could separate Ergot's vision from its poison, the careful detoxifying of aconite root in Chinese medicine, these were not superstitions. They were dosing technology refined over generations. The ritual itself, the controlled setting, the fasting, the supervision, functioned as a primitive form of harm reduction, a way of fixing the set and the setting so the drug did what it was meant to do. It is worth saying plainly that natural, in the ancient world, never once meant safe, and the modern echoes are everywhere, from the narrow window of the heart drug digitalis to the lethal arithmetic of opioids. And that shared fragility of knowledge is exactly why so many of these drugs were lost. The strangest thing about these powerful drugs is how completely some of them disappeared. We can hold a 1,000-year-old bag and chemically identify 5 substances inside it, yet we cannot always say how the people prepared them, how they dosed them, or what the experience truly meant. The knowledge evaporated, and it did so in a handful of recurring ways. Secrecy was one. The Eleusinian initiates were bound by a death oath, so the recipe at the center of the most important rite in the Greek world was deliberately never written down. When the rite ended, the secret ended with it. Migration was another. The likeliest reason Soma vanished is that the people who revered it moved away from the land where its plant grew, and a sacred drug with no living plant becomes a memory and then a debate. Suppression did the rest. Christianity shut down the pagan mysteries. Spanish authorities attacked Coca as devil worship before deciding to profit from it. Across the colonized world, indigenous drug knowledge was reframed as idolatry or vice and driven underground, and much of it was simply destroyed. What survived often survived as fragments, a folk remedy here, a ritual there, with the original reasoning stripped away. People remembered that a plant worked without remembering how or why. This is why so much of what you have heard tonight is reconstruction rather than inheritance. We are recovering this pharmacology through chemistry, the ancient texts never recorded, reading residues with mass spectrometry like a time machine, leaning on dry caves in high altitude and frozen ground to preserve the molecules long enough to find them. And that recovery is dangerous in its own way because reconstructing the dose of a drug that kills is not a casual experiment. For centuries, the wrong plants were even identified as the ancient drugs. A few living threads do remain unbroken. Zoroastrian priests still press Haoma from ephedra, a line running back to the Bronze Age. Indian people still chew coca much as their ancestors did. But the gap between an artifact's chemistry and the experience it once produced may never fully close. It would be wrong to think modern medicine simply rejected all of this. In truth, it inherited a great deal of it, then quietly threw away the part that made it dangerous. Walk through a hospital and you will find the descendants of these ancient drugs everywhere, purified, measured, and tamed. Atropine and scopolamine, the tropane alkaloids of Mandrake and Datura, sit in the anesthesiologist's tray in the emergency cart, used to steady a failing heart, to dry secretions, to treat poisoning. Ergometrine, from the same ergot that may have powered the kykeon, is given to stop a mother from bleeding to death after childbirth, and ergotamine treats migraine. Apomorphine, from the Lotus lineage, helps people with Parkinson's disease move again. The lesson the modern world learned was not that these plants were useless, it was that the plant was never the right unit. The right unit was the molecule, isolated and dosed to the milligram. That single shift from swallowing an unpredictable whole plant to administering a precise purified compound is arguably the foundation of all modern pharmacology. It is why cocaine, the very same molecule that destroys lives on the street, can still be used safely as a topical anesthetic in certain surgeries. The amount and the control are everything. Some compounds, like mescaline, were largely set aside not because they did nothing, but because their effects ran too long and too intense to be practical next to newer drugs. And yet something genuine was lost in the trade. The ancient combinations, the shaman blending stimulant and hallucinogen, anticipated what we now call combination therapy, and we are only beginning to take that seriously again. The recent revival of research into psilocybin and MDMA, conducted with enormous caution, is in some sense a return to questions these cultures were asking thousands of years ago. Researchers still hunt through aconitine-like molecules for a safer painkiller. The ethnobotanical pipeline, the slow flow of plant knowledge into the pharmacy, has never actually stopped. What modern medicine cannot bottle is the experience itself, the meaning these drugs carried, which no purified molecule alone reproduces. For all of this, the honest position is that we are still standing in the dark holding a flashlight. The biggest questions remain wide open. We still cannot identify Soma with any confidence, and serious scholars still line up behind fly agaric, ephedra, and Syrian rue. We still do not know for certain whether the kykeon was truly ergot, or whether the visions at Eleusis were chemical at all. We do not really understand how ancient specialists managed to control doses of drugs whose potency swung so wildly, or how often things went catastrophically wrong, because the failures rarely left a written record. There's also a vast amount of evidence simply sitting untested. Museum collections around the world hold vessels, residues, and human remains that have never been run through modern chemical analysis. And every time someone does, the timeline of human drug use lurches further back. But the methods have limits. Residues degrade, samples get contaminated, and a single molecule's presence does not prove intent. Finding a psychoactive compound on an artifact does not tell you whether it was a sacrament, a medicine, a poison, or an accident. The gap between chemical presence and human meaning is the hardest gap in all of archaeology to cross, and the questions reach deeper in time than you might expect. There is intriguing evidence from the El Cedron cave in Spain that Neanderthals were chewing bitter. Medicinal plants like yarrow and chamomile, plants with no nutritional value, suggesting that the use of plant chemistry to alter the body may be older than our own species. Whether earlier humans deliberately sought out psychoactive plants and when that relationship truly began may be unanswerable. New analytical techniques keep promising to reopen old finds, and the ethics of actually reconstructing these dangerous preparations grow thornier as we get better at it. Some recipes, guarded and then forgotten, may be gone for good. Which leaves us with a final question, the oldest one of all. Step back from the individual drugs and a single staggering picture comes into focus. The human relationship with these powerful molecules is not a modern problem or a recent vice. It is one of the oldest technologies our species possesses. 8,000 years of Coca in the Andes, 2,500 years of ritual cannabis in the mountains of Central Asia, temples in Peru engineered around a cactus, a book of scripture in India devoted to a drug. Every inhabited continent independently found its way to potent psychoactive plants and built meaning around them. This is not a footnote to the human story. It is close to its center. And notice how thoroughly these substances refuse to stay in one category. They were medicine and religion and politics and intoxication all at once. The same drug that healed a body could summon a god, legitimize a ruler, or kill a rival. The shaman in the Bolivian rock shelter was the first pharmacologist and the first physician, the keeper of a knowledge so dangerous it had to be wrapped in ritual and taboo. When we call these drugs too powerful for modern medicine, we are saying two things at once. We are saying their chemistry is too variable and too lethal for our standards of control. And we are admitting that they once commanded a kind of awe that our pharmacy shelves have drained away. We have purified their molecules and scheduled their use and stripped them of their gods. We have gained safety, and that safety is real and worth having. But we have lost the experiences that no isolated compound restores, and the reverence that made people guard these plants with their lives. The same danger that made them deadly is what made them sacred. Stand again over that 1,000-year-old bag in the Andean cold, 5 drugs nested inside a pouch of fox snouts, and you are looking at the unfinished work of understanding our own minds. These plants still fascinate us, and they still frighten us, for exactly the same reason that they fascinated and frightened the people who first knelt to prepare them. They always have, and they always will.